Every mixer has a variety of options for routing or directing the signal through the console and finally out of an output to your speakers. Let's have a look at these and what they are typically used for. As with most features, the more advanced the mixer, the more options are presented for routing, and we choose how we use these based on the application we are in. For example, we may need more subgroups or auxiliary outputs based on the requirements of the act we are mixing or the system we need to build. To keep it simple, let's look at the various things we can run into in common mixers. Every sort of mixer has a main or master bus output. Oh, and before we get too far, outputs are commonly referred to as a bus. The master output can be made up of a separate left or right output or a combined mono output. If you're working with a simpler system, these may also be zones, like different rooms in a conference center. Typically, you can choose what amount of input signal goes to each output by panning, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The next most popular output is an auxiliary output. This output allows you to send any of the input signals to a separate source than your main output, and at different controllable levels. An easy example would be stage monitors for musicians. Another bus commonly found is the subgroup. While most consoles do have outputs for the subgroups to send the signal out of the console, these are typically used for grouping like input sources to control the mix balance at once. For example, drum microphones. We would route the channels we are using for drum microphones into subgroups and not directly to the main outputs. The subgroups are then routed to the main outputs, and we now can control the balance of the selected channels as one group. This is much easier than trying to move 8 to 10 faders at once to turn up or down the drums as a whole and maintain their balance. An output bus you'll find typically on larger, more complex consoles is the matrix output. Much like an aux, the matrix allows you to mix a separate output from your main house mix. The difference is that a matrix is set up to take output buses rather than input channels. For example, if we wanted to feed an overflow room and didn't want to mix each input over again through an aux, we could use a matrix. We could feed this matrix from a mix of our main output mix and then perhaps blend in a little bit more of the vocals so that they are heard a little bit more pronounced in that overflow room than we have in our main house mix. One more option we often find are mute groups. While not an output per se, a mute group allows us to assign a group of input channels to be muted at one time with one button. Again, we typically group like channels so that we can mute the band's inputs together once they've finished up and unmute the speaker's mics. While there are a few options we haven't covered, these are the most commonly found options in most consoles.